So it's an election year, in case you hadn't noticed. And it's caused me to think back because one of our kids will be voting in 2 years in his first election. And so I was thinking back to my first election, which was in California in 1998. And California is known for its ballot initiatives. Every election cycle, there are at least a baker's dozen of these initiatives where the population of California can vote directly on legislation, constitutional amendments. I am grateful to have been living in Michigan for the last 10 years where those are not nearly as common. It's a lot to put on a voter to vote directly on legislation. And there was one measure in particular that I remember from that year that was a proposed law to ban the eating of horses in the state of California, which was perplexing to me. I didn't know that that was something that was going on with enough frequency to require legislation to stop it. But it was also interesting because it spoke to what I think most of us would feel is kind of an internal sense that there's something wrong with eating the flesh of a horse, in a way that we don't feel about eating the flesh of a cow, or a pig, or other farm animals. And objectively, physically, there isn't a ton of difference. Now, I want to assure everyone here, I have never eaten the flesh of a horse. So I can't say whether there's some culinary delight that we're all missing out on, but it was interesting that this is something that was not just a question of like the ethical treatment of the animals in the butchering process. It was like we should as a society ban the consumption of horses. In the same way that we would all feel revulsion at the consumption of dogs. There's something that we feel that's like a moral disgust. And that's the kind of thing that's going on in our text this morning. In this story, Jesus is being called to account for the behavior of his disciples that I've dubbed the dirty dozen. They're in trouble because they're eating with unwashed hands, and this is part of a body of traditions and laws and rules and regulations that the people of Israel follow that are here called the traditions of the elders. And before we get into this, I just have to acknowledge that this passage and others like it in the Gospels, where Jesus confronts the way that the Pharisees and the scribes and the teachers of the law implement these rules, have been used as a cudgel. They've been used as a weapon of virulent anti-Semitism that the church has been part of fostering for over 2,000 years. And we have to acknowledge that history, that these texts have been used to promote a hatred and a dismissal of the Jewish people, and that is absolutely foreign to their purpose. We need to acknowledge that. We are trespassing into someone else's traditions, and we often do that with sort of a comical dismissal of the Pharisees as these out-of-touch hypocrites. And to be fair, Jesus goes right to that point in this passage. They ask a question, why aren't your disciples washing their hands? And for those of us who have just lived through a pandemic, we might well say to Jesus, yeah, don't they know about germ theory? Don't they know that you should wash their hands? And I remember going to the market for a year and not going back into the house without washing everything that we brought back. So before we throw too many stones at the Pharisees, let's just all acknowledge we're on Team Pharisee here when it comes to washing hands and food. But Jesus goes right to saying, you're hypocrites. He goes right after them as completely missing the core of pure religion. So there's something going on here. But there's a context to what the Pharisees are hearkening back to. And they're not just like an overzealous homeowners association captain who's just wanting to micromanage everybody's life. These were vital issues of identity for the people of Israel. About a century and a half before the time of Jesus, one of the Greek rulers of the land of Israel had started a campaign of assimilation, where before the Jewish people had been allowed to maintain all of their traditions, all of their unique identity markers that set them apart as the people of Israel. This Greek ruler started to outlaw all of those sorts of practices. And the Jewish people rose up in revolt against that because for them, maintaining those sacred identity markers was how they received God's grace and love as they understood it. And that was not a small matter. And so when a ruler came along and said, you must do work on the seventh day of the week, you must consume pig flesh, You must not circumcise your boys on the 8th day of their life. Those were fighting things, and Jewish people rose up and in many cases were martyred and killed for refusing to go along with this program. So when the Pharisees, whose movement was traced back to that starting point, are bringing this to Jesus, it's not just about some nitpicky religious rules. These are quite literally matters of life and death for them as they understand it. And so we do well to understand that as well. But Jesus points them to something deeper and more significant. Jesus suggests to them that they have missed the point of what those rules and regulations were there for, what made them worth the defense that the Jewish people had made of them. And so I want to take us back further than Moses. The traditions of the elders go back to Moses and the laws that were implemented at Mount Sinai. But the creation story that is older, that is more original. For the Jewish people, all of these identity markers were part of maintaining the sacred space of the temple, the place at which they encountered God. But the creation story does something very interesting. The creation story in Genesis 1 and 2 establishes that there is sacred space everywhere. As we sang earlier, that the earth and all of its fullness is sacred space where the divine seeks to interact with humanity. And that it is not just some humans that mediate that encounter as a special priesthood, but in fact, all humans, male and female, across the board, are mediators of the divine presence in all of the physical creation. And when it comes to food, God was very clear when he said, I give all of it to you for food. Which is why Paul gives instructions to Timothy that says, all food is to be eaten if received with gratitude and joy. And so Jesus, I think, is hearkening back to something deeper. He's not dismissing the traditions of the elders, and it's interesting that they always ask, why are your disciples doing this or that? They're picking grain heads on the Sabbath. They're not washing their hands. It suggests that Jesus may have been following all of these rules and his disciples weren't, which is an interesting notion. But he always goes to bat for his disciples. He always has their back when the Pharisees come and say, why aren't they? But they're calling into question Jesus' value as a rabbi. Your disciples aren't following the law. How can you call yourself a teacher of the law? So they're coming after Jesus, but I think Jesus is pointing us to something truer and deeper. That there is no sacred space. All space is sacred. There are no holy people. All of us are holy. There are no sacred foods. All food is a gift from God. There are no sacred times. All time is a moment in which we can encounter the divine. What's interesting is what we read in James earlier also calls to attention this idea of being defiled. This idea that something can corrupt us, can separate us from the divine. And that's what's in view here. And in both the letter of James, James goes on to talk about the people who are being excluded by the group that he writes to. And in that case, it is the poor who are being excluded, cut off because of their status as poor people. The rich are being favored in James's letter. And in Mark's gospel, the very next story is about Jesus going to the most defiled type of individual you could imagine. A woman from the city of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon were symbolic of the most distant people from God in the Old Testament. And Jesus goes to a Syrophoenician woman and learns something from her about grace and acceptance and welcome. It's a challenging but a beautiful story. And I think it's no accident that it follows on this passage about defiling, because what we're really talking about is not food. What we're really talking about is not hand washing. What we're really talking about is who belongs, who is welcome, who is accepted. And is it the people who follow what we consider to be identity markers that are critical to being in? Or is it everyone? And of course, here at St. John's, as we've already observed, as we observe every Sunday, we know the answer is everyone. Here's the tricky part about answers that we already know. to questions that we ask a lot. It's easy to say it, it's easy to affirm it, but our challenge is what James told us to do, to not simply be hearers, but active doers. We say this every Sunday, you are welcome here, and we mean it. And we say we mean it, and we do. But we can often say things like that uncritically. And so I started to think deeply about this week. Because one of the interesting things, the last time that I preached, it was about food, and now we're talking about food again. It's not planned, that's just what's in the reading schedule. But part of that is because food is a dominant theme throughout the scriptures. Because it's core to humanity. And last time we talked about the abundance of food, that we don't have to worry about scarcity. And the early church practiced an abundance mentality, sharing food generously and lavishly, visiting widows and orphans in their distress, the mark of pure religion according to James. But it was also something that the early church fought about viciously. There were real conversations about whether people who didn't follow particular dietary laws could actually be part of the people of Jesus. Because what had started to happen is the early church took Jesus seriously when he said that all foods were clean and all people were welcome. Peter famously was confronted with this vision of a sheep being lowered down out of heaven with all the animals you weren't supposed to eat. And he was told, get up and eat. And Peter said, no, I won't. I've never touched anything defiled. 3 times, because Peter always takes 3 times to get something or more. 3 times the sheet is lowered, and 3 times Peter has the audacity to say to the risen Jesus from heaven, no, I won't do what you're telling me. And then, because it's not really about food, Cornelius the Gentile shows up at his door. And Peter says, oh, I get it. It's not about food. It's about people. And he sees that the Spirit is poured out on Cornelius, and so he says, if God has accepted Cornelius, who am I to say that Cornelius is not welcome among the people of God? And so Gentiles, non-Jews, began to join the church, and they started bringing their bacon-wrapped shrimp to the church potlucks, and there were problems. There were challenges. And those challenges are real, and Paul spends no fewer than 3 of his letters addressing the food fights of the early church. And he comes down very solidly on the side of everybody eat whatever you want and don't judge anybody for it. You want to keep the dietary laws? Blessings on you. You understand that Jesus meant what he said, and bacon-wrapped shrimp is not only delicious but also morally acceptable? Good on you. Just don't exclude anybody over what they eat or over whether they wash their hands before they do. And so I had to start asking myself, these were issues for the early church. We don't have those kinds of food fights as much anymore, although people do take what they eat very seriously sometimes and often can be judgmental about it. But because it's not about food and it's about people, I started to reflect. And in our political cycle that we find ourselves in, for the last 9 years, we have had virulent discussions about who really belongs in our American society, who really gets to participate. Certain voices have been talking very loudly for the last decade about who the real Americans are. And it's easy, I think, for me to say, yeah, that clearly has nothing to do with the way of Jesus, but that's never been my temptation, so it's not a challenge for me. But I started to reflect as I reflected on this passage, preparing for today, that there's been a more recent voice that's been talking about who's normal and who's weird. And I began to be concerned that from within my heart, something about that resonated. Something about labeling and categorizing individuals or groups as outside of the norm, enough to be pushed aside, was attractive to me. And so I had to hear the words of Jesus anew and say, whatever the legitimate concerns are that's producing that kind of rhetoric, I need to be careful that my tongue is bridled. that my heart does not give in to imagining that there are people different enough from me that I can label them weird and write them off as not worthy of participating in the human project. That's a challenge for me. I speak only to myself. I have a rule, by the way. I only preach to myself, and I just let other people listen in. So if that's a word for you, well and good. But I also want to say, with that caution and that concern, an affirmation. James 1:26 and 27 have been significant verses for me for 15 years now or more. 3 characteristics that James identifies as being central to pure religion. Religion, by the way, is not a word that shows up in the scriptures very frequently. And it simply means to reconnect, to rebind the divine and the human. And we imagine that religion comes with all kinds of trappings and rituals and rites and traditions. And James says 3 things. A bridled tongue. Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. It's interesting how speech and anger, being quick, go together. Because, and this just needs to be said over and over again, your anger does not bring about God's righteousness. A bridled tongue. Looking after widows and orphans in their distress. Widows and orphans is biblical shorthand for those who are often on the outside. And keeping oneself unstained by the world, undefiled by the world. The world's way, and it's not just the Jewish people, it's all of us. The world's way that corrupts and taints us is the tendency to draw those lines, to define who's in and who's out, to define who's doing it right enough to be included and who needs to be excluded because they're dirty or weird or different. That's the world's way. And so keeping ourselves undefiled by the world means over and over and over again affirming the radical, lavish, and universal welcome of the divine. It's not something that we extend one directionally. It's why we pass the peace together every week. Each of us extends it to the other. It is not that some of us possess welcome to extend to others who need it. All of us are called to extend welcome, and all of us need to receive welcome. We sang it earlier. It's not my table. It's not your table. It's Jesus' table. So we don't get to exclude anybody from it or have authority over the welcome. That's already been taken care of. And in the 2 years that I have been part of St. John's, I have found this to be a place that prioritizes and centers those 3 things. We look after those who are excluded. We're careful about our speech and how we talk about and towards others. And we do our best by coming week in and week out and reminding one another about the way of Jesus that erases the lines the world loves to draw. Amen? Amen.